The sound of the phone echoed in the silent room. Richard, always busy and focused on his business, ignored the ringing until Emma, his wife, answered with her usual calm tone. "Yes, of course. I'll call my husband," she said. Her gaze shifted to Richard, who continued typing furiously on his laptop, oblivious to her presence. "Richard, it's a lawyer," he said. "He has something urgent to tell you about your uncle's inheritance," Emma said, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Richard raised his eyes, surprised. Inheritance? He didn't have deep ties with his family and barely remembered the uncle the lawyer mentioned. "What does he want with me now?" Emma handed him the phone with an expression that mixed curiosity and apprehension. Richard listened attentively to the lawyer's instructions, while his face changed from a bored expression to one of pure surprise. The distant uncle, a man he barely knew, had left him a fortune he never could have imagined. Apparently, it was investments in valuable lands and properties. Richard felt a wave of excitement he hadn't shown in a long time. As soon as he hung up, his mind was already racing. "Emma, I'm going to need to reorganize a lot of things. This money is going to transform my business," he said, without even acknowledging her role in the initial conversation. Emma watched silently. She knew Richard had always been arrogant, always absorbed in his grand projects, but something about that conversation made her uneasy. She stepped away, returning to her daily activities, while Richard was already making frantic calls, talking to business partners about expansion and new investments. Emma knew Richard would lose himself even more in his selfish world. In the following days, Richard devoted himself entirely to the idea of expanding his company. He spoke incessantly about opportunities and how the inheritance money would allow him to soar even higher. Emma, as always, remained silent, observing him as he convinced himself he was in control of everything. It was during a rainy afternoon, while Emma reviewed documents in the office, that she found something intriguing. Among the papers regarding the inheritance was a clause that Richard had clearly ignored or forgotten to read carefully. The contract mentioned that Emma also had rights to the inheritance, being a co-owner of everything he thought was solely his. Emma stood still, processing the information. Her heart raced, but not out of fear or anxiety. It was a feeling of power she had never experienced before. She knew this changed everything. And for the first time in years, Emma felt she had something in her hands that could turn the tables. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Sophie, the young artist with whom Richard had been having an affair for months, even though he believed Emma would never find out. Her voice was low, almost whispered, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Is Richard there?" Sophie asked, trying to disguise her nervousness. Emma smiled to herself, realizing how everyone underestimated her intelligence and insight. Without directly answering the question, she ended the call, hanging up with a decisive click. In that moment, Emma knew it was time for Richard to pay for every slip, every betrayal, and every silent humiliation he had caused her over the years. She closed the contract about the inheritance with a renewed calm. The game was just beginning. The days following Emma's discovery were silent, almost cold. Richard was more absorbed than ever in his ambitions, and Emma, always discreet, stayed on the sidelines, observing and planning. Richard barely noticed his wife's presence as he spent hours on the phone with investors, lawyers, and consultants, weaving his web of expansion. "This money is going to take us to another level, Jack," Richard told his longtime lawyer and friend. "We're going to invest in commercial properties in London and, who knows, expand into the international market. What matters now is keeping everything under control and discreetly out of Emma's reach." Richard was obsessed. He knew that Emma, although intelligent and educated, had never been interested in business. He always considered her a passive woman, perfect for silently supporting his climb to success. She won't even understand these details, he thought. However, what Richard ignored, or preferred not to see, was that Emma was much more aware of everything than he imagined. She knew the numbers, the meetings, and, most importantly, she knew about the betrayal. With each call Richard made to Sophie, his mistress, Emma felt a new brick being added to the wall she was beginning to build between them. One night, While Emma prepared a cup of tea in the kitchen, she overheard Richard on the phone in his office, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Sophie, don't worry. As soon as the deal is finalized, we can spend more time together. She doesn't even know half of what's going on." Richard laughed, his voice filled with confidence. Emma stopped at the door, hidden in the shadows, her cold eyes watching him like a predator lurking. She said nothing. She knew her silence was her greatest weapon in that moment. Richard underestimated her in every possible way, and Emma was willing to use that to her advantage. The next morning, Richard woke up early, anxious for a crucial meeting with new investors. He gave Emma a quick kiss on the forehead, without even looking her in the eyes, and rushed out, talking on the phone even before getting into the car. With the house silent, Emma sat in front of Richard's laptop. She knew he wouldn't let her participate in the meeting, but she also knew he had forgotten a small detail: the password to his computer, which she had discreetly observed while he worked the night before. Emma's heart raced as she typed the password. The computer unlocked, revealing a series of confidential emails and files. Investments, contracts, and finally, a message that made Emma stop breathing for a second. It was an email from Jack, Richard's lawyer, confirming that the documents for transferring part of the assets were almost ready, but with a curious detail. Richard was trying to move a large sum of money to an offshore account, out of any oversight, and he hadn't included Emma's name in any part of the dealings. "He's trying to completely shut me out," Emma thought, feeling the anger pulse through her veins. But instead of panicking, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Richard's treacherous move, while infuriating, gave her the confirmation she needed. He had no idea how far ahead she already was. That afternoon, Emma did something she hadn't done in years. She picked up the phone and called the lawyer her father had used to handle the family business years ago. Oliver Harrington, a shrewd and discreet man, answered with his deep, polite voice. "Oliver, it's me, Emma Miller," she began. "I need your services. It's a matter of inheritance and possibly a divorce. I think things are about to get complicated." Oliver, without asking unnecessary questions, simply nodded on the other end of the line. "All right, Emma. Let's start working on this immediately." Emma hung up the phone with a renewed sense of power. She knew she couldn't confront Richard directly, at least not yet. The path to victory would be long and full of obstacles, but she was ready for every step. By the end of the day, when Richard returned from the meeting with a victorious smile on his face, he found Emma at the dinner table, looking calm and indifferent. She served dinner without mentioning what she had discovered. "How was the meeting?" Emma asked, pretending her usual disinterest. "Perfect," Richard said, a gleam of arrogance in his eyes. "Soon, everything will be in our hands." Emma simply smiled back, keeping her true thoughts well guarded. She knew that from that moment on, the cards were on the table, and the game was about to change irreversibly. The next day, Richard left home early as usual, completely immersed in preparations for the company's expansion. The inheritance money seemed to burn in his hands, and he was impatient to turn his newly acquired fortune into an even bigger empire. For Emma, however, this was the perfect moment to act. After days of observing and analyzing Richard's every move, she decided she could wait no longer. The calm and patience that had always defined her were now giving way to a silent determination. That afternoon, while Richard was out, Emma picked up the phone once more and called Oliver Harrington. The lawyer, experienced in delicate cases like this, answered promptly. "Emma," Oliver's voice sounded firm and professional, "I've already started reviewing the documents you sent me yesterday. There's something you need to know." Emma felt a tightening in her chest, but maintained her composure. "Go ahead." "Your husband, Richard," Oliver began cautiously, choosing his words carefully, "is trying to transfer a large portion of the inheritance assets to an offshore account. He apparently plans to do this without your consent." Emma had expected something like this. Nothing Richard did surprised her anymore, but hearing it out loud further fueled her resolve to fight. "I suspected as much, Oliver," she said, taking a deep breath. "What can we do to stop him?" "Well, he cannot legally exclude you from an estate that is partially yours as stipulated in the inheritance contract." Unless you sign something, he won't be able to complete those transfers, Oliver explained. But you'll need something more solid if you want to confront him. Let's prepare a strategy to block those moves definitively. Emma listened carefully to every word. She knew this was not just about protecting her legal rights, but about finally stepping out of Richard's shadow, where she had been for years, and positioning herself as the strong figure she always knew she could be. And now she had the right tools to do so. That evening, Richard came home with a self-assured gleam that bordered on disdain. He sat down at the table with a smug smile, as if the world were in his hands. Emma maintained her composure, hiding her plan behind a facade of passivity. Soon, Emma, we'll be on another level, he said, slicing a piece of meat with precision. The investors are ready, and the money. Well, the money is flowing better than I expected. Emma watched him speak, while in her mind the details of her own plan began to take shape. She knew Richard was about to fall into his own trap. The decisive meeting with the investors was scheduled for the following week, and it was there that Emma would make her move. In the following days, Emma continued to act cautiously. She didn't want to raise any suspicions, so she followed her routine, ensuring that Richard believed she remained in the position of a submissive and uninformed wife. But behind closed doors, she and Oliver were compiling a dossier that would ensure she not only prevented Richard from stealing her share of the inheritance, but also put him in a position of vulnerability in front of all those he sought to impress. On the eve of the meeting, Emma received a call from Sophie. Surprisingly, the young woman sounded even more nervous than before. Emma, I don't know if I should tell you this, but Richard, her voice trembled. Emma closed her eyes, controlling the urge to reveal that she already knew everything. What is it, Sophie? Emma asked, trying to sound confused, but with a hint of impatience. What happened? Sophie hesitated before continuing, her voice low and shaky. Richard told me he's thinking of leaving after the meeting with investors. He said that we're going to New York. Inside, Emma laughed at the irony. Richard thought he could simply run away, start a new life with his mistress, and leave Emma behind. He truly believed she would never take action. Little did he know, his escape would never happen. Don't worry, Sophie, Emma said, her tone a mix of calm and a slight veiled threat. Tomorrow's meeting will change a lot of things. And trust me, you'll see that things aren't always what they seem. Sophie, clearly confused, fell silent for a few seconds before murmuring something unintelligible and hanging up. Emma put the phone back on the hook and leaned back in her chair. The next day would mark the beginning of a new phase. On the day of the meeting, Richard woke up excited, convinced he was about to pull off the biggest coup of his career. He barely noticed Emma as he got ready to leave, focused on his notes and presentations. Emma, for her part, had everything prepared. She would arrive at the meeting shortly after Richard, with Oliver by her side, and reveal to everyone present who really held the control over that inheritance. When Richard left the house, Emma made a final adjustment to the documents she would take with her. Oliver had been meticulous. Every detail was perfectly aligned for the final confrontation. It's time, Emma, she said to herself, looking in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, she saw the strength that had always existed within her, but had been kept hidden, suppressed by years of submission and neglect. She closed the folder of documents, grabbed her car keys, and left the house, determined. What Richard didn't know was that the meeting he had been eagerly anticipating would be his ruin. The cold wind blew over London that morning, but inside the luxurious building where the meeting was to be held, the tension was even more chilling. Richard arrived at the venue confidently, greeting investors and partners with the smile he reserved for important moments. He could hardly wait to present the impressive numbers that the inheritance had allowed him to achieve. This was his chance to show everyone his success, and more importantly, his absolute control. Gentlemen, he said, shaking hands with potential international investors, we are about to take our company to a global level. As Richard prepared to start the meeting, Emma discreetly arrived outside, accompanied by Oliver Harrington. They were not expected there, and that was part of the plan. Emma wore a simple yet elegant suit, reflecting the seriousness and power she now felt. Beside Oliver, She walked through the hallways with a calm that concealed the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "Are you ready?" Oliver asked quietly as they waited for the right moment to enter. Emma nodded, her eyes fixed on the door ahead. More than ever. Inside, Richard was approaching the climax of his presentation. The room was filled with executives and investors who listened intently to his words, projecting profits, mergers, and future acquisitions. He was at his peak, exuding confidence. And, of course, Richard continued in an authoritative tone, "As the majority shareholder and sole heir, I can guarantee that the expansion will proceed without any obstacles." It was at that moment that the conference room door swung open and Emma entered, alongside Oliver. The sound of her footsteps interrupted Richard mid-sentence, and the look of surprise in his eyes was impossible to hide. He hadn't expected to see his wife there, let alone accompanied by a lawyer. What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice slightly trembling but trying to maintain composure in front of the audience. Emma's eyes locked onto Richard's. For the first time, she didn't look away. On the contrary, she stared at him with an intensity he had never seen before. It was as if he were facing a completely different person. "I'm here as co-owner of this inheritance, Richard," Emma declared firmly, drawing all eyes to her. "And I believe there's something important that these gentlemen need to know." The silence in the room was deafening. Investors exchanged confused glances as Richard desperately tried to regain control of the situation. "What are you saying, Emma? This is not the time for—" he began, but Emma interrupted him, something she had never done before. "Richard," she cut in, her voice as sharp as a blade, "there's a clause you conveniently overlooked. Or perhaps you tried to hide it. Your uncle's inheritance does not belong solely to you. By right, I am co-owner of everything being discussed here." Oliver handed a folder to the investors closest to them, containing a copy of the legal documents. A murmur began to spread quickly through the room as executives examined the paperwork with growing interest. "This is absurd," Richard said, his face beginning to lose its usual arrogance. "These documents mean nothing. I am responsible for the family business." "Emma, you don't know what you're talking about." Emma remained unfazed. She was ready for every word Richard would throw at her. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, a look of disdain on her face. "And you know it too. The difference is I won't let you pull a fast one on me, Richard. Not this time." The investors began to ask questions, intrigued by the new information. Some looked at Richard with suspicion, while others turned to Emma, seeing in her a strength they had not noticed before. She, who until then had only been seen as a discreet figure, was slowly starting to gain respect. "How dare you show up here with this?" Richard exploded, his patience finally wearing thin. "You know nothing about running a business. I built all of this. I won't let you destroy everything in one meeting." Emma kept her cool, even as Richard lost control. "What are you trying to do, Richard?" Emma asked quietly but firmly. "Run away with the money? Divert the assets to accounts that can't be traced? Abandon all this and run to another country with Sophie, perhaps?" Sophie's name dropped in the room like a bomb. Some investors began to murmur among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the new direction the conversation had taken. Richard, on the other hand, turned pale. He never imagined Emma knew about Sophie, let alone that she would dare to expose it there, in front of everyone. "You," Richard stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. "I know everything, Richard," Emma said firmly. "And I will ensure everyone here knows who you really are. Not just an ambitious businessman, but a man who tried to deceive me, who attempted to legally betray me." She looked around, meeting the investors' eyes with determination. "You are about to invest in a company whose financial decisions have been compromised by the dishonesty of someone who should be leading it." The investors began to gather their belongings, some getting up in discomfort. One of the main investors, Michael Evans, a man known for his extreme caution, approached Richard with a stern expression. "Richard, I think we will have to postpone this discussion until you two resolve this," he said, his tone serious. "I cannot invest in a company where there is so much uncertainty and, clearly, a dispute over assets." Richard, now at a loss for words, watched as his plans crumbled before him. Every investor who left the room was a blow to his confidence, and every look Emma cast in his direction seemed to further bury his reputation. Emma remained resolute until the last investor exited the room. She watched as Richard sank deeper into his own defeat, and for the first time, he seemed to realize he no longer had control over the situation. When the room was finally empty, Richard turned to Emma, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "This isn't over," he said through clenched teeth. "You'll pay for this, Emma. I'll destroy you." Emma looked at him for a long moment before responding with a calmness that disarmed him. "No, Richard. The one who will pay is you." The conference room was now empty, except for Richard and Emma. The tension between them was palpable, almost suffocating. Richard still stood near the table, his fists clenched, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. The image of a powerful, self-assured man had been shattered before the eyes of everyone he had tried so hard to impress. Emma, on the other hand, remained calm. Her expression was serene, but her eyes sparkled with the determination of someone who would no longer accept being underestimated. "This isn't over," Richard muttered through clenched teeth, his voice low but filled with threat. He stepped closer to her, his eyes boiling with hatred. "You exposed me, humiliated me in front of everyone. But don't worry, Emma. This isn't finished yet." Emma stood unshaken. She knew that this moment marked the beginning of a war, and she was ready for all the battles that would come. For the first time, she was no longer the passive woman Richard had known, but someone who had learned to play the same game, and perhaps even play it better. "Richard," she began, her voice controlled, almost cold, "you created this situation. All I did was ensure that I received what was due to me. If you think you can destroy me, I suggest you rethink your strategy. Now, you're no longer dealing with the wife you thought you could deceive." Richard looked at her for a long time, as if assessing how far Emma would go. He had underestimated her strength before, but now, seeing her like this, he felt she was no longer someone he could manipulate. She had transformed into a real adversary. "Let's see how much you can take," he said, in a venomous tone, before grabbing his briefcase and leaving the room. Emma watched him go, taking a deep breath. She felt the weight of what had just happened, but at the same time, a sense of quiet victory began to spread within her. She knew Richard would try to retaliate, but she was no longer the same woman who silently accepted humiliation. Now, she had control, and that changed everything. In the following days, the repercussions of the meeting began to spread through Richard's business world. Several investors who had previously shown interest started to hesitate. The reputation he had built over the years was being undermined by doubts and suspicions, many of which arose after the confrontation with Emma. He knew that every unreturned call, every canceled meeting, was a result of that moment when he lost control. At home, the atmosphere was tenser than ever. Richard came home late and avoided Emma at all costs. When they were in the same space, the silence was deadly, charged with resentment and frustration. "This can't go on," Richard thought, locked in his office one night, analyzing the numbers that now seemed increasingly grim. He knew he had to act quickly. His ego couldn't take any more humiliation. He needed to regain control, and to do that he would have to remove Emma from the equation once and for all. Meanwhile, Emma, in her own space, was far from relaxed. She knew Richard was plotting something. He was too vengeful and arrogant to let the situation slide. Over the time they had lived together, Emma had come to know every facet of his personality. She understood that he wouldn't give up easily, and so she kept her guard up. One night, while Emma was reviewing some documents, she received a call from Oliver Harrington. The lawyer had been discreetly monitoring Richard's financial activities. "Emma," Oliver said, getting straight to the point, "I think you need to see this." Emma frowned, concerned. "What is it?" "Richard is trying to sell one of the properties that's part of the inheritance," Oliver explained. "He wants to do this discreetly, without your knowledge. Apparently, he's in a hurry to move the money. He's probably trying to send it to some offshore account, as we suspected." Emma took a deep breath, trying to process Richard's new attempt to outmaneuver her. But this time, she was ready. "Don't worry, Oliver," she said, her voice determined. "We'll block this. I want to prevent any sale until everything is clarified. I won't let him get away with anything. Oliver confirmed that he would take legal steps to stop any transactions without Emma's signature. But beyond the financial matters, Emma knew Richard was going too far. He was desperate, and a desperate Richard was dangerous. The next morning, Richard was in the kitchen, idly flipping through a newspaper when Emma came down the stairs, already prepared to leave. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, not looking up from the paper, but with an obvious tone of irritation. Emma paused for a moment, looking at him with a calm but firm expression. "I'm meeting with Oliver to sort out some details about the inheritance," she replied directly. She knew that mentioning Oliver always made Richard even more nervous. Richard shot her a contemptuous look. "You think you can keep this under control for how long? Do you really think I'm going to let you bring me down?" Emma smiled slightly, as if she were hearing something pathetic. "I've already brought you down, Richard." She stepped forward, her voice low but filled with conviction. "And you still don't realize it." Richard fell silent, his face growing increasingly red with rage. Emma turned and left the house, leaving Richard with the words caught in his throat. As Emma met with Oliver, Richard's plans were heading towards a critical point. He could no longer contain his frustration and anger. The failure to control the inheritance, the public humiliation at the meeting with investors, and now the fact that Emma was always one step ahead made him lose his patience. Richard decided to take drastic measures. He began reaching out to people who owed him old favors, men with whom he had done shady business in the past. If he couldn't defeat Emma legally, then he would do it his way. The cost didn't matter. For him, the end justified the means. While Emma felt she was one step closer to securing her legitimate share of the inheritance, Richard was about to embark on a more dangerous and dark plan, one that would plunge both of them into a spiral of irreversible consequences. The following days were a true minefield for Emma. Although she maintained a firm and determined demeanor, she knew Richard was preparing something bigger, something that didn't just involve legal disputes. She could sense it in the air, in the way he looked at her, as his actions became increasingly unpredictable. As Emma moved forward with her lawyer, blocking Richard's attempts to sell the inherited properties, Richard, on the other hand, reached out to old acquaintances, men whose names would never appear on official documents, but who had ways to solve problems outside of the courts. One night, while Richard was in his office, he made a call to Frank, an old business partner who now operated in the shadows of the corporate world, offering quick and discreet solutions for delicate issues. "Frank, it's Richard. I need a favor," he said, his voice low but filled with frustration. "Richard? Long time no see. What do you need?" Frank replied, his tone curious. "Something complicated, I imagine." Richard hesitated for a moment, but then let his anger take over his words. "It's my wife, Emma. She's trying to destroy me, Frank. I need you to take care of this. I want you to intimidate her. She needs to understand that she can't keep getting in my way." Frank fell silent for a few seconds, weighing the situation. "You're talking about a scare, right? Nothing too serious?" Frank asked, always cautious about the limits of his actions. "Yes, just a scare," Richard lied, his mind already moving in much darker directions. "Just enough to make her back off and let me do what needs to be done." Frank, who had dealt with similar requests in the past, agreed. He knew it wasn't the first time a businessman had approached him to resolve sensitive family matters. However, even with the promise of it being just a scare, Frank was well aware of the fine line being crossed. The next day, while Emma continued her preparations to face Richard in court, she had no idea that a new threat was forming around her. Richard's plan was underway. However, something unexpected happened. Later that week, Emma began to notice something strange. While walking the streets of London, she felt as though she was being watched. At first, she thought it was paranoia, a result of all the stress the dispute with Richard was causing her. But as the days went by, that feeling of being followed intensified. One night, as she returned home, Emma noticed a car parked at the corner of the street. Its headlights were off, but the engine was still running. A chill ran down her spine, but she decided not to let herself be intimidated so easily. She entered the house and closed the door firmly, trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence. But it wasn't. That same night, while Emma reviewed some documents in her home office, the phone rang. She frowned when she saw an unknown number on the display. For a moment, she hesitated to answer, but something inside her made her pick up the phone. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was silence on the other end of the line. She could hear a faint, almost imperceptible breathing. "Who's there?" Emma asked, her voice now firmer. Finally, a hoarse voice spoke from the other side. "Be careful, Emma. You don't know what you're getting into." The call was disconnected before she could respond. Emma's heart raced. She stood there, holding the phone, fear swelling in her chest. She knew this wasn't just an empty threat, it was Richard. He was behind this, she was sure. Emma felt anger rise within her, pushing the fear to the back of her mind. No matter what Richard tried, she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had endured. The next day, Emma went to Oliver Harrington's office. "He's going too far, Oliver," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "I'm being followed. I received a threatening call last night. Richard is desperate." Oliver, who always maintained a calm and professional demeanor, furrowed his brow upon hearing this. He knew the battle with Richard wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to escalate to this point. "If he's resorting to these tactics, it means we're getting close to exposing him," Oliver said firmly. "What do you want to do, Emma? We could take this to the police, but without evidence, it would be difficult." Emma interrupted him, shaking her head. "I'm not going to the police yet. I want to see how far he'll go. If I give in now, he'll win. And I won't allow that." Oliver nodded, respecting Emma's decision. He knew she was playing a dangerous game, but he also understood her motivation. Emma was determined to confront Richard head-on, without fear. As Emma grew stronger, Richard spiraled into paranoia. He felt things were getting out of control. The threats he had sent to Emma didn't seem to be having the desired effect. She wasn't backing down, on the contrary, she seemed even more determined to destroy him. One night, Richard was in his home office, reviewing his finances in search of a way out. He was about to make another illegal transfer when his phone rang. It was Frank. "Richard, I need to warn you. We're not going to continue with this," Frank said directly. "What? What do you mean?" Richard replied, unable to believe what he was hearing. "The situation is getting too complicated. Your wife isn't the type to back down easily. And honestly, Richard, this is going too far. If she suspects anything, you're going to burn bridges. We can't proceed with this anymore." Richard fell silent for a moment. He gripped the phone so tightly that the knuckles of his fingers turned white. "I'll pay whatever it takes, Frank," he said, his voice desperate. "I just need her to stop. I just need Emma to disappear from my life." Frank sighed on the other end of the line. "Richard, sometimes things get out of control. My advice? Resolve this another way, legally. Because if this continues, you'll end up in deeper trouble than you can imagine." Frank hung up, leaving Richard alone with his rage. Now, without his partners willing to help him, Richard felt cornered. Emma was winning, and he couldn't stand the thought. Richard's gaze turned to the window, where the city of London sparkled with its nighttime lights. In his mind, something dark was forming. If he couldn't make Emma back down, he would have to find another way to defeat her. And this time, he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took. The pressure on Richard was unbearable. Every attempt to intimidate Emma had failed, and his darker contacts, like Frank, were no longer willing to continue the game. He felt the net tightening around him. The decisions he had made over the past few weeks were turning against him, but Richard was still unwilling to surrender. That same night, after his call with Frank was abruptly cut off, Richard went to his home office, where he had spent most of his days recently. The drink in his hand trembled slightly. He had always liked to feel in control, but now everything was falling apart. His fortune was threatened, his reputation among investors had been destroyed in the meeting, and worst of all, his own wife, whom he had always underestimated, was winning. Richard threw the glass against the wall, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the room. He took a deep breath, his fists clenched. "She will not win," he kept repeating to himself. "I still have one last card to play." Richard's last hope lay in a risky move. He still had a secret account in a tax haven that Emma didn't know about, and if he could transfer enough money before the inheritance freeze became official, he could disappear, maybe even convince Sophie to go with him to a place where they could start over. If I vanish before everything collapses, Emma will never find me, he thought. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Emma was also preparing for what was to come. After days of being watched and intimidated by Richard's tactics, she refused to feel cornered. Though she was tired and mentally exhausted, her determination was stronger than ever. The next morning, Oliver called early. "Emma, I need you to come to my office today. Richard is acting fast. He might try to make a financial move before the court finalizes the freezes," Oliver said, without beating around the bush. Emma took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She knew Richard would still try to escape with something, but she didn't expect him to move so quickly. "I'll be there in an hour," she replied, resolute. She knew this was a critical moment. She couldn't hesitate now. Upon arriving at Oliver's office, Emma went straight to the point. "What do we need to do to stop Richard?" she asked, not hiding the urgency in her voice. Oliver sighed, handing her a folder of documents. "We're already working on a financial freeze, but that takes time. If he's smart, he could try to divert the money before everything is finalized. And Emma, I think you should know, Richard has a secret account in a tax haven. He's playing hardball." Emma gritted her teeth. She had expected something like this, but hearing Oliver confirm it felt like a blow. "I want to freeze everything," she said firmly. "We can't let him escape this time. I'll do whatever it takes." Oliver watched her for a moment before responding. "We're close, Emma. Very close. But to ensure he can't divert anything, we might need to take a more direct approach. We need to pressure him before he makes his next move." Later that day, Emma returned home. The atmosphere was silent but heavy. Richard hadn't come back yet, which was unusual. She used the time alone to reorganize her thoughts and plan her next steps. Determined, she went to Richard's office, which she had been avoiding since tensions had risen. Emma knew Richard was meticulous, but she also knew he had made a mistake: his overconfidence. He had always believed she was incapable of understanding the details of the business, and that had put her at an advantage. As she opened the drawer of his desk, she found documents that Richard, in his arrogance, hadn't protected as he should have. There were notes about properties, printed emails, and amidst the pile, something caught her eye: a draft of a financial transfer letter. She had no time to waste. Hours later, Richard finally arrived home. He looked agitated, more so than usual. Upon entering the office, he found Emma sitting in the chair he usually occupied, the transfer letter in her hands. What are you doing?" Richard stammered, surprise clear in his voice. Emma looked at him calmly, raising the paper. "I found this. It was on your desk. Were you going to transfer money, Richard? Illegally? To escape?" Richard paled, his mind racing to find an explanation. But there were no more excuses. "You don't understand anything, Emma," he said, trying to sound superior, but his voice faltered. "I was doing this to protect what is mine, what is ours." Emma stood up from the chair, facing him with a strength he had never seen before. "Don't lie to me, Richard. You were trying to escape and leave me with nothing. But it won't be like that. I've already taken measures. The accounts are being frozen. Soon, all your businesses will collapse." Her voice was cold and determined. Richard felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. He was cornered, and for the first time in his life, without a way out. His mind raced for a solution, but there was nothing more to do. Emma had defeated him. You can't do this," he shouted, his voice overflowing with desperation. "I'm responsible for everything. You have no idea what you're doing." Emma, impassive, just watched him. He was desperate, and she knew it. It was the end for Richard. "No, Richard," she said firmly. "You have no idea. I know exactly what I'm doing. And now, it's your turn to pay for everything." Richard, with no more words, just looked at her with hatred. He was defeated, and they both knew it. That night, Richard locked himself in his office, lost in his thoughts. The silence of the house was disturbing, as if the world around him was closing in. He was alone. Everything he had built, Everything he had fought for was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Emma climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of a long battle finally nearing its end. She knew there were still details to resolve, that the legal war would continue, but for now, she had control. Richard was broken. But Richard still had one last card to play. As he watched his finances drain away and his allies disappear, he knew that if he couldn't defeat Emma with money, he would do it another way. His dark mind began to work on a desperate plan. One that would change everything, definitively. He would not allow Emma to walk away unscathed from this war. The hours seemed to drag in that silent house, now divided by an almost unbearable tension. The confrontation between Richard and Emma had reached a critical point, and while Emma slept in the guest room after yet another exhausting night of documents and legal strategies, Richard remained locked in his office, where his mind was concocting something dark and definitive. He had no more options. The accounts were frozen, the investors had abandoned all hope of a profitable future with him, and even his darkest contacts refused to get involved. Everything was crumbling, but Richard would not accept losing. Not like this. Not to Emma. That night, Richard made one last call. Not to lawyers, nor to men like Frank. He contacted someone he hadn't seen in a long time, someone whose name didn't appear in records, nor in the memories of his old business partners. "I need something definitive," Richard murmured, while the other person listened attentively on the other end of the line. "And it needs to be done soon." The voice on the other end responded in a calm but cold tone. Richard knew there would be no turning back after this. He understood he was entering dangerous territory, but his mind no longer saw another way out. If Emma wouldn't back down, he would destroy her another way, and this time, he wouldn't show mercy. Meanwhile, Emma, in her relentless quest for justice, began to sense that something was different. In recent days, Richard seemed more restrained, less willing to confront her directly. This, rather than being a relief, left her on high alert. What was he planning? Emma knew Richard was not the type to simply give up, especially after everything he had lost. That morning, while reviewing the reports Oliver had sent her, Emma received an unexpected message. It was Sophie, the young artist with whom Richard had been having an affair. Emma, though surprised by the contact, answered, curious about what she might want. "Emma, I don't know if I should have called," Sophie began hesitantly. Her voice was trembling, almost scared. "But I think you need to know. Richard, he's different. He's saying things that frighten me. He wants to leave the country, but not before doing something to you." Emma's heart raced. For a moment, the silence between the two women seemed to carry all the weight of the tension surrounding Richard. "What do you mean by doing something?" Emma asked, her voice firm, but fear beginning to take shape. Sophie hesitated, as if she knew she was about to cross a dangerous line. "I don't know exactly, but he talked about revenge. About ending you once and for all." Emma took a deep breath, trying to process this. She knew Richard was capable of thoughtless acts, but what Sophie was implying was something much more serious. Something that could put her life at risk. "Thank you for warning me, Sophie," Emma said, hanging up the phone afterward. Her face remained impassive, but inside, she was on high alert. She knew Richard was becoming increasingly dangerous, and now her suspicions were confirmed. Emma needed to act quickly. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The thought that Richard might try something violent haunted her. She locked all the doors and windows, and, in an almost instinctive gesture, picked up the phone to call Oliver. She explained the situation, and Oliver immediately suggested she leave the house and stay somewhere safe. "Emma, you need to get out of there.
Now."
"We can't take any risks," he said, his voice filled with concern. But Emma hesitated. Leaving the house would be like giving Richard the feeling he had won, and she couldn't bear the idea of appearing weak, especially now that she was so close to securing a legal victory. "I'm not leaving here, Oliver." "That's exactly what he wants." Emma tried to keep her voice steady, but the truth was that fear was starting to infiltrate her defenses. Oliver insisted, but Emma was adamant. She decided that instead of fleeing, she would stay and face Richard, but with caution. She would take all precautions, staying alert to any suspicious movement. That early morning, around 3 a.m., Emma was awakened by a noise coming from downstairs. Her heart raced. The sound was low, but enough to alert her that someone had entered the house. Trying to control her panic, she slowly got up, grabbed her cell phone, and quietly called the police while moving through the hallway. The tension in her body was almost unbearable. As she approached the stairs, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps. Richard. He was inside the house. Emma looked around, searching for an escape route. She knew that going down the stairs was risky, so, holding her breath, she retreated to the bedroom, closing the door and locking it. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she feared Richard could hear it. She grabbed a chair and wedged it against the door, trying to reinforce the lock. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. On the other side of the house, she could hear Richard's footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. He knew she was there. "Emma." Richard's voice echoed through the house. "I thought you were stronger than this. Aren't you even going to show yourself to face me?" Emma held the phone tightly, praying for the police to arrive in time. She knew Richard was about to do something terrible. "This doesn't have to end like this," he shouted, now closer. "But you've left me no choice." Emma heard the sound of a key turning in the front door. The police had arrived. Richard's reaction was instant. He heard the officers calling from outside, asking him to come out with his hands up. There was a moment of tense silence, as if he was deciding what to do. Emma stayed still, holding her breath, praying he wouldn't do something crazy. Finally, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stairs. The police had intercepted him before he could act. Hours later, Emma was still in shock. Sitting in the living room, with the comforting presence of the police, she tried to process everything that had happened. Richard had been taken away by the police, and the nightmare, at least for now, seemed to be over. But fear and adrenaline still lingered, echoing in every corner of the house. Oliver arrived shortly after, concerned for her well-being. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her. She nodded slowly, although she knew that nothing would be the same after that night. He was going to do something terrible, Oliver, Emma murmured, feeling tears sting her eyes. Oliver watched her for a moment before placing his hand over hers, in a gesture of support. "I know, but now, he can't hurt you anymore." Emma knew the battle was far from over. There would be legal proceedings, agreements to be made, and the scars of that night would remain with her for a long time. But one thing was certain. Richard had lost. And Emma, even in the face of all the terror, had won. The night that seemed endless finally gave way to a silent dawn. The house was strangely calm, as if the events of the night had been a distant nightmare, but Emma knew it was real. Richard had been taken away by the police, and now she found herself alone in the space they once shared, a place that had once been home to a life of appearances, but now felt like a silent battlefield. In the police station, Richard sat in an interrogation room, his face haggard and his eyes vacant. The arrogance that had always defined him had vanished, and the man now staring at the wall was merely a shadow of the confident mogul who had tried to dominate the world around him. Failure consumed him. He knew his businesses were ruined, his finances in collapse, and justice was in motion. Emma, his underestimated wife, had become his greatest adversary, and she had defeated him. Outside, Oliver Harrington was overseeing the legal proceedings to ensure Richard remained in custody. What Richard had planned against Emma was serious, and Oliver knew the court would not be lenient with him. In addition to financial issues and fraud involving the inheritance, Richard now faced charges of attempted assault and threats, complicating his future even further. But while the legal procedures advanced, Emma dealt with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had won the battle against Richard, but the price had been high. The last few weeks had consumed her from within, and although she had managed to stay strong, now, alone in that house, she felt the weight of everything that had happened. For the first time in years, she was free, but that freedom, in that moment, felt strangely empty. A few days later, Emma went to Oliver's office to discuss the next steps. The divorce process would be formalized, and all inheritance matters would be resolved. Oliver assured her that Richard would have no access to any assets and that attempts to divert funds abroad were blocked. "He will answer for everything," Emma, Oliver said, with reassuring firmness. Legally, he has no more power. The investors are aware of the situation, and his name is tarnished in the market. You don't need to worry about him. Emma nodded, grateful, but something in her heart was still restless. And about what happened that night? She asked, referring to Richard's attack. Oliver took a deep breath, aware of the emotional impact that event had left on Emma. The criminal charges are underway. There's no way he's getting away with this. He will be tried, and it's very likely he'll face prison time. Emma, I understand you're worried, but Richard can no longer reach you. He is lost. Emma knew Oliver was right. Richard no longer had the power to hurt her, at least physically. But the emotional scars he left were deep. She had spent years underestimated, ignored, and now, after so long, she finally had control over her own life. However, what would come next? What to do when the war finally ends and silence settles in? A few weeks later, Emma found herself at a point of reflection. The house, which had once seemed a battlefield, was now being sold. She no longer wanted to stay there. The place was steeped in bitter memories, and Emma wanted a fresh start. Part of the inheritance that was now under her control would be used to rebuild her life away from London, where she could start anew without the weight of the past. The sale of the house was not difficult. The location and property value made it an easy target for interested buyers. But for Emma, what was at stake was more symbolic. She wanted to completely free herself from everything that represented her life with Richard, and leaving that place behind was the first step toward that. On the morning she handed the keys to the new owner, Emma made sure to walk through the house one last time. Every room brought back a memory, a battle fought in silence, a pain that had been kept inside for so long. Now, as she walked down the hallway, she felt a lightness she had never thought possible. As she stepped out the front door, a sense of closure enveloped her. She looked back at the house one last time, took a deep breath, and finally allowed herself to move on. While Emma rebuilt her life, Richard was increasingly sunk in the consequences of his actions. The trial was progressing, and with overwhelming evidence, a prison sentence was almost certain. He was isolated, abandoned by those who once considered him a big name in business. Even Sophie, the young artist he had used as an emotional refuge, had left him. Richard, who had taken pride in controlling the fates of others for so long, was now powerless. However, for Emma, the focus was on the future. She had regained control of her life, and now, free from Richard's weight, she wanted to start over. She decided to leave London behind and move to a small town in the countryside, where she bought a simple yet cozy house, a true home, far from the intrigues and lies that had marked the last years. Days passed more peacefully. Emma finally found the peace she had long sought. The divorce process was completed, and with it came the certainty that the most painful chapter of her life had come to an end. A year later, Emma was walking through the streets of her new town, finally feeling at peace. The sun shone softly, and she allowed herself to smile. The battle she had fought with Richard now felt like a distant memory, a nightmare she had overcome. The phone rang. It was Oliver. Even after everything, he remained a reliable figure and a source of support. "Emma, I'm just calling to give you the final news," he said. "The court decided today. Richard was convicted. He will serve time for the crimes he committed." Emma took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief. It was the definitive end. Richard was out of her life, once and for all. "Thank you, Oliver," she said, her voice calm but filled with new hope. "Finally, I can move on." She hung up the phone and continued walking, the feeling of freedom stronger than ever. Richard was a part of the past, and now, the future belonged solely to her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give a like, and share the video. Until next time.